It's a shame to see a perfectly good CPU being wasted in a laptop. No shade to laptops, of course. They need good components too, I guess. But when it comes to making a compromise between balls-to-the-wall performance and ball-shriveling thermal limits, laptop makers usually err on the side of protecting their nuts. The Ryzen 9 7945H X3D is a frankly insane mobile chip, basically a 7950X3D in a soldered BGA form factor, so bleeding fast you'd struggle to find a desktop GPU that could keep up with it, let alone some misleadingly named cut-down Max-Q model. If only it were available on some kind of desktop motherboard, with a proper PCIe slot for a real graphics card, and access to hundreds of watts of power. It's this one. It's why you're watching the video. If you're not as borderline obsessed with mini PCs as I am, you might be forgiven for not being familiar with MinisForum. Aside from making some of the better value micro-sized computers out there right now, they've also branched out into making ITX motherboards with integrated mobile CPUs. I first became aware of them a year or two ago when they first offered the BD790i with a 16-core Ryzen 9 7945HX. Even that's an insanely powerful chip for mobile, especially for a compact workstation or server build, but slapping an extra 64 megabytes of L3 cache on board puts this firmly into the leagues of the best gaming CPUs on the planet. Being a relatively small brand with more experience in mini PCs does mean there are some quirks in the design. It's very cool to see features like an integrated low-profile heatsink and active SSD cooling, and you get some modern conveniences like Bluetooth, Wi-Fi and USB-C, even if it is only Gen 3.2. However, you also have to make do with SODIMM memory slots, meaning there's not much room for high-performance RAM, and while you get an actual UEFI with a real GUI, it's still got that weirdness you've come to expect. You have all the usual ridiculously granular controls that 99.9% of people will never need, but no XMP or Expo profiles. The RAM can be tuned, but the timings have to be entered in hex rather than decimal, just as I found when tuning the Ryzen HX 370. AMD overclocking controls like PBO are present, but hidden away. And perhaps that's for the best. From my testing, every amount of curve optimizer introduced some level of instability. Perhaps worst of all, there's no room for saving profiles, meaning that if you want to test different memory timings, as I've spent much of this week doing, it's pretty slow going. So why would this weirdly high-end motherboard and mobile CPU combo be interesting? After all, if you wanted an ITX motherboard with a limited BIOS, you could just get an A620. Well, partly it's to do with price. MinisForum is currently listing this board for just $599, which is about $100 less than the desktop 7950 X3D on its own, and even the cheapest ITX AM5 board is another $150. You could get one of these, a case, a 120mm fan, a solid power supply, and probably even some RAM, and still be paying less than the scalper price on a 9950 X3D on its own. In this economy, even people looking to build an elite gaming rig could stand to save some money, especially if you're saving enough on the CPU that you can afford a higher tier of GPU, or pay for your tariffs. Setting up the board is fairly simple. Both NVMe slots are hidden under a heatsink and cooled by a small fan, which is a nice touch but can be disabled in the BIOS or simply unplugged if you want to cut down on the fan noise. While the CPU also has a pre-installed heatsink, it doesn't come with a fan. I used a Thermalright 120mm model from one of their dual tower coolers, and it does a decent job, though temps do get pretty high under load, so perhaps something with a higher RPM will be in order. I've paired the BD790i X3D with 64GB of Fury, which was kindly provided by the folks at Kingston for this video. This kit is clocked at 5600 CL40, but as the MinisForum lacks profiles, you have to enable manual RAM clock speeds under the AMD overclocking section before going into the DDR menu and typing in 5600. The rest of the timings were then applied automatically, so there's no need for a hex calculator. As I mentioned before, I also spent a great deal of time tuning this kit. I received a list of appropriate timings from Alexei, the guy who lent me his Franken GPUs and who has some experience with MinisForum motherboards and SODIMM memory. And while I was somewhat successful at getting the RAM down to CL28 with sub-timings that would have put desktop chips to shame, it wasn't entirely stable. Some games were fine, but Cyberpunk crashed every time RT was enabled, and CS2 refused to launch at all. I might have to revisit this for a future video, but my time and patience ran out for this one, so all the results I published are at stock timings. My GPU of choice is the same Radeon RX 7900 XT I use for all my CPU testing, and everything is powered by an 850W Corsair PSU. I've changed my methodology slightly. My new way of testing games involves cranking up quality settings rather than reducing them. You would think that this risks making the system GPU limited, but I offset this by using FSR Performance or Ultra Performance to drop the render resolution to 480p or 360p respectively. It can still be borderline in some games, putting a lot of load on the graphics card and sometimes approaching 90 to 95% utilization. But on the other hand, quality settings can sometimes affect processor load too. Games like Cyberpunk use a lower traffic density at lower quality presets, which means less AI for the CPU to handle. The best use case for a CPU like this would be in a hybrid workstation gaming PC, as few productivity tasks benefit from 3D Vcache, and few games benefit from 16 cores. In fact, the extra cores can be detrimental. I found Cyberpunk 2077 in particular gave a bit of an unpleasant gaming experience out of the box. The issue is caused by the two CCXs. Each CCX has 8 cores, but only one of them has 3D Vcache. With game mode enabled, Windows should ensure that games only load up the CCX that's attached to the Vcache. However, it doesn't always seem to do the job. Cyberpunk is stuttery as all hell, both in game mode and without it, and the only solution I found that could make the game playable was to use an app called SMUDebug to put the chip into 3D Turbo Mode, which disables the other 8 cores entirely. Performance-wise, the 7945H X3D is keeping up with chips like the 7900 X3D and i9-12900KS, and if you have a powerful enough GPU, you can run at 100 FPS average even in the Ultra RT mode. The Last of Us Part 2 is out now, but Part 1 is still notoriously heavy on the processor in certain areas. At 1080p Ultra with an eye-melting amount of upscaling, the CPU is the limiting factor, and so, again, paired with a sufficiently powerful GPU, you could max the quality sliders out and still get 144 FPS. Fully disabling 8 cores doesn't do anything for the average, but it does wonders for the frame time graph. 1% lows climb from the high 70s to almost 100 FPS. Spider-Man 2 has proven to be a severely unoptimized port, and has real issues on less powerful CPUs, and even on more powerful ones. The 7945H X3D, which I'm just going to call the 45 from now on, is very capable without ray tracing, passing the 100 FPS mark in my test run along Broadway, but enabling RT brings that crashing down. I don't have a powerful enough GeForce to compare right now, but the Radeon RX 7900 XT doesn't appear to be fully utilised, so I don't think it's holding the game back, which means that, regardless of how good a graphics card you own, you're probably limited to about 70 FPS. Stalker 2 is another CPU heavyweight, and yet the 45 breezes through it. The X3D chip can run this intensive game at over 140 FPS on average in game mode, though once again manually disabling the non-Vcache cores helps tremendously with the frame pacing. I'm not going to say this is a stutter-free experience, because Stalker 2 is a UE5 title, and some degree of shader compilation and loading stutter is all part of the charm, but the 45 delivers as good an experience as I've ever seen. Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 can see frame rates start to drop once the enemy count starts to climb, so it's a great use case for a high-performance CPU. Interestingly, this and Spider-Man 2 are two games that don't seem to much care how many CCXs are being used, and Space Marine sees both configurations come close to a 100 FPS average with lows of almost 80. Starfield is a game most people on YouTube don't talk about anymore, unless they're making a video essay about the death of Bethesda, but it's one I still keep around for testing CPUs because of how much it taxes them. At over 100 FPS in game mode, it's doing pretty well for itself, and fully disabling the second CCX only gives a small bump to 110, with most of that being at the low end. Of course, the strongest reason for many sweaty gamers to invest in a high-performance CPU is Counter-Strike, and naturally it flies along on the 45. CS2 has become a bit of a mission to benchmark lately. I can't find a way to just run a casual deathmatch in Dust 2, so I have to play matches in other maps until that one comes up in the rotation. Still, I got there in the end, and it was worth it. The 369 average is about on par with every other modern Ryzen CPU. With SMUDebug, that average climbs to almost 390 FPS, which is actually the best result I've seen so far. Not too shabby for a laptop chip. The gaming results are excellent then, but they don't really point to a solid reason for this motherboard to exist. Most games benefit from having half of the cores disabled, so there's no practical difference between this and, say, a 7800 X3D. The real benefit comes from having that extra CCX for non-gaming applications. In Cinebench 23, the 16 cores are really coming into play, and the 7945H X3D scores phenomenally well. It might not mean much as I haven't tested a lot of the newest CPUs, but this is the highest multi-thread score I've ever seen, and while the single core score is a bit short of a 12th gen i9 or even a full-on desktop Ryzen 9 7900 X3D, it's still approaching the 2K mark. Most of my points of comparison for Cinebench 24 are mobile chips, and of course the 45 blows them all away. With a multi-core score of 1776 and a 45 in the name, I think I've just thought of the perfect TV ad for the American market. These high scores come at a price. By the end of the test, the package temp on the 45 is passing 85 degrees under full load. This isn't quite at the point of thermal throttling, but inside a case that might be a different matter. On the one hand, the ambient was a few degrees warmer than usual, it's been very pleasant in the UK lately, and my flat was measuring around 24 degrees, but this is definitely a nail in the coffin for the slim 120mm fan idea, and an argument for perhaps swapping out the thermal interface material. Interestingly, the 45 doesn't score quite so well in Geekbench. The multi-core score of 18156 and single-core score of 2901 come in behind both the i9 12900KS and the 7900 X3D in both regards. In Blender, meanwhile, this is an absolute blazing fast performance. The 45 can complete the classroom render in just 2 minutes 38, about 25 seconds faster than the socketed 7900 X3D and almost 50 seconds faster than the 12900KS. Obviously, these are great results, at least on paper. Even from a practical standpoint, the BD790i X3D is a really attractive product, and while not completely free from the jank we associate with these motherboards, there's not much to complain about. There's certain intrinsic factors that will be a deal breaker for some people. There's zero CPU upgrade path, so while the 7945H X3D is enough to handle the best graphics cards 2025 can throw at it, that might not be the case in a couple of years' time, and it's already one generation old. The SODIMM RAM slots aren't necessarily a huge issue unless you need more than 96GB and also access to higher clock speeds, lower latencies and fancy heat spreaders. The ITX form factor does at least maximise case compatibility, though it's also limiting for people who need extra slots for, say, capture cards, or more than 2 NVMe drives, or some SATA storage options. Finally, the supplied heatsink is only barely sufficient, and in warmer climates or more intensive environments, it might not be up to the task. With those caveats in mind, I think that for a lot of people this is still a pretty compelling option, and is probably one of the best value high-performance ITX solutions around. Thanks to MinisForum for providing the review sample, and to Kingston for helping out with the RAM. Check out the Kingston Fury kits at the link in the description. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.